Hello there, my fellow thinkers and dreamers. This is Mind Palace Musings, and I am your host, David Wellman. In the past few episodes, we explored death and immortality, and those topics are a bit dark and heavy, and tend to put people in a space of existential crisis. So, hopefully it won't be the case with this episode. No promises, as always. So, what are we going to discuss today? Well, I'm going to discuss something that, ironically, we don't think about much because that is thinking itself. Today we are going to be talking about thought. What it is, why it is, how it is, who it is, where it is. I don't know, let's use all the question verbs. Thinking is something we are all intimately aware of because we do it throughout the day, throughout the year, throughout our entire life. Some people do not think enough, and those people are usually put into positions of power and governance, usually by people who also don't do much thinking. So we could all use with, we could all do with a little more thought. I guess besides those who overthink things and are prone to anxiety or neurosis, like myself occasionally. But anyway. So, as I mentioned earlier, thought is not something we think about often. It's kind of a backdrop. It is the substrate on which everything we experience occurs. It's not often that we think about it because we usually don't think to think about it. It's a very strange situation we find ourselves in, to think about the layer at which we think. But let's talk about that in the meat of the episode. Without further ado, let's get started with today's topic: thoughts on thought. So, what assumptions are we making today? Well, the first assumption we'll make is that everyone thinks to some degree or another, some more than others, usually some more than most. I think that makes sense. I don't know. Anyway, thoughts are beyond pure survival mechanics. While they may feed into our own survival as physical, material beings, they're not necessarily, it's not the only purpose of them. And finally, thoughts are inherent to the human consciousness, which may or may not be detached from the physical body, and thoughts themselves may or may not happen partially outside of the human body. What is thought? Well, thought is defined as an idea or opinion produced by thinking or occurring suddenly in the mind, which I usually don't like definitions that have their own meaning in the definition, because, well, I suppose a thought is like a noun produced by the verb of thinking. So, fair enough, dictionary, you win there. You get off easy this time. Thought is an important part of learning and interacting with our world beyond base instinct like many animals do. The thinker is a popular statue that is often used as a whole to symbolize philosophy, the field of thought. Thought is the only thing we know to exist for certain, as is posited by solipsism. We can verify the existence of our own thoughts, but of nothing else for certain. And I have discussed this in a previous episode titled Life is But a Dream. Now, to dwell on that for a bit, the voice inside our head, or for some who don't have it, which I have heard is a thing and even verified with a friend who says she does not think in words but rather images, which is funny because I have aphantasia, so it's like, two sides of the same coin. She's mind deaf and I'm mind blind. Anyway, that voice in our head is, or has been with us for as long as we've been around. That is the entity or the being that we interact with the most out of anything in our lives. It's the only thing we know that exists for certain. And based on today's assumptions, we're also going to assume that is the case for everyone else. Now, our brains are incredibly complex meat computers powered by chemicals and electricity. It's these bursts of electricity that form the material basis of our thoughts. Now, whether there is a non-material component of thought is yet to be determined, and this is something difficult to verify or even measure with modern material reductionist science. It's a hard question to answer considering consciousness is such a complex phenomenon, that's right. It's difficult to study the nature of oneself while living in that experience. It's the sandbox conundrum where being inside a sandboxed environment may feel completely real, but you've been in a simulation or an illusion the whole time. It's difficult to study something from the inside. Back to the meat brain. Neurons are excitable cells that fire off bursts of electricity. This forms the basis of thought, in the material world anyway. There are various specialized types of these cells which respond to external stimuli and send those signals to the brain. And the way our brain interprets these signals models how we experience the physical world. As discussed earlier, earlier in the podcast, not earlier this episode, everything we experience could be a lie and could be completely formed just based on how our brain interprets these signals. Now, thought is both conscious and unconscious. We have different layers of thought all happening at the same time. You can think of it as a processor in a computer which handles various things currently as we deal with them, but also various things in the background. Our conscious thoughts as we sit with them are the things helping us go from moment to moment. Things like, should I go eat? Should we have this painful memory from 15 years ago play again for the 15th time today? Should I text my friend? Things like that. It is these unconscious thoughts that will handle things that we aren't even aware we're thinking of at the time, but may manifest later as a conscious thought, or probably after we needed to remember it, as is usually the case. And we can then ask, are thoughts some trivial construct that we can simply will into existence at a moment's notice? Or is there some unseen process that must occur in order for a thought to form? Beyond the biological and electrical components, perhaps there is some external conscious construct that we just cannot see or measure that formulates thought as we need it, which also brings into question, are our thoughts even ours? Some research has been done to show that decision-making typically happens before we realize it. The signals that fire to let our brain know that we have made a decision typically happen before we've actually made that decision, which, cycling back around, brings into question free will, which will be the topic of another episode, because I don't think it's an interesting thing to discuss in this episode specifically. Now, unconscious thought can be very valuable. It can lead to creativity, ingenuity, the discovery of new inventions. And the most common occurrence of this in media or just popular culture is what's known as a shower thought. Sometimes if you're sitting trying to tackle an issue for hours on end, your brain is so engaged that it's formed itself into a pattern that is perfectly suited to deal with the current issue at hand, but shuts off all other avenues of thought because you're currently dealing with that issue. If you then take some time to relax, have a snack, go take a shower, and those thought patterns kind of degrade and, your brain goes back to its normal way of thinking, suddenly you may have a burst of inspiration saying, aha, that's the issue. I'm a software developer by trade, and these things happen often. Usually, dealing with a software bug, the best way to deal with it is to go make a cup of coffee or go take a walk, because sitting there looking at the problem is not a good way to solve it. I have to internalize the issue and allow my unconscious thought processes to go pick up that item of work, do some formulations on it, and come back to me later. This is the handing over of a thought from conscious thought to unconscious thought. We can also think of it like the spinning of a hard drive. Now, I realize hard drives actually aren't used that much anymore with computers, since most modern computers have moved over to solid state drives. But for those who don't know how they work, a hard drive disk uses magnetic spinning plates and encodes information on these plates with magnets, and then it can read the information by spinning the plates, which is why it sometimes takes a longer time to get all of the information needed, because those bits of information might be stored in different spaces. So you need to spin the disk around multiple times at very high speeds to quickly read things off. I'm sure everyone's had this situation where you know that there's a specific word for the situation that you want to use, but at that moment in time, you just cannot think about it. It is gone. For all intents and purposes, you've never known this word. You may be a fluent speaker of the language, but at this point you feel like it's your second or third language because you can't remember a word that should come to you so easily. And then later, probably in the shower, you're going to be like, fuck, that was the word. Why couldn't I have remembered that hours ago? And that is in part due, again, to the way our brain might form these temporary thought patterns that are valuable at the time for dealing with the issue, but it might accidentally partition off useful information that you might need. It might decide that the partition of your brain in which that specific word is stored is not useful for the task at hand, therefore you do not have access to it. And try as you might, you will not remember that word because it is blocked off. Only when you remove yourself from the situation in which that thought pattern, let's call it, is required, can those barriers break down and allow you to remember the word. And because you've still got that unconscious thread of thought going that knows that you need that word, even though the conscious mind is no longer focused on it, it will eventually come to you, whether you like it or not. Now, our brains and bodies are very clever and complex, and a lot of what happens has been abstracted away from us. There's millions of processes going on in our bodies on a daily basis that mean that we get to just focus on the very high level decisions that allow us to survive. We don't have to sit and focus on digesting because our body handles that for us without us ever even knowing how it happens. This is a concept in programming called abstraction, where you build a layer on top of something more complex, hide the complexity to a level where it's not needed, and that makes it easier for everyone involved. There's a reason why there are more programmers today than there used to be in the 60s, because of decades of abstraction and language improvements that now mean I personally can develop systems to a higher degree, more complex, more functionality, more feature-rich, with more processing power than a whole team of developers from the 60s. It's abstraction. Now, we must sit and wonder, how much abstraction is there on the process of thought? Again, is it simply trivial that we can snap and a thought has been created? Or is there a whole conscious production line in the mind palace that must be ordered in advance and have work done on it, and order forms being signed and parts being delivered, and in that span of time we eventually get a thought delivered to us? Are these thoughts even ours, or are they being delivered from some external place outside? That's an interesting topic that I do want to discuss in a future episode. According to Wikipedia, although thinking is an activity of an existential value for humans, there is still no consensus as to how it is adequately defined or understood. Put plainly, there is existential value in the mere act of thinking. From a survival standpoint, thinking allows us to plan ahead, strategize, and make plans beyond daily survival. It's what separates us from many animals where survival is simply a string of instinct, and it allows us to actually strategize for the future. Instead of thinking, I must get water and food daily, we can plan ahead and say, if we build the village by a river, that sorts out our water problems, and if we domesticate some animals and start a plot of land for farming, that sorts out our daily food needs. And due to this very process, it's thanks to that I can sit here rambling on about my weird theories and ideas through a microphone made out of metal into a computer powered by electricity and then put out onto the internet for people to listen to, or not listen to. That's up to you. It's thanks to this that civilization exists. And it's not just for it's not just for survival and invention. It also allows us to be creative. Something like painting doesn't have any immediate existential value if you think from a survival standpoint, but the way I see it, we set our brains, as mentioned, our brains are incredibly complex chemical machines, and as beings we are filthy chemical addicts that want to get our grubby little fingers on every little bit of serotonin and dopamine and endorphins that we can. Things like art allow us to kind of create a debt that needs to be paid off in the future. Starting with a blank canvas, I know that if I put in some work, once I have finished that final pencil stroke or brush stroke, I'm going to get a sense of achievement. I'm going to check a box. I'm going to complete a quest. I'm going to get a little hit of that sweet, sweet dopamine. It's why we get addicted so easily to things like sugar, stress, alcohol, social media, etc. It's an easy way to cheat dopamine. And who's to say that this is not still thinking on an existential level? If we consider our existence not only the need for food, water, shelter, warmth, things like that, but also our own mental well-being and health, we can consider things like this, as mentioned, an existential value. It's the same reason why people might want to invent things or help other people or create or sing or dance. They are fulfilling a need that their brain has decided is important to their survival as a conscious being. Thinking is a way for us to plan out our future and manifest reality, because we can figure out pathways to achieve our goals and needs. This potentially evolutionary reflex to keep us going and give us a constant stream of reward chemicals. If we consider things like depression and anxiety due to chemical imbalances in the brain and as mental illnesses, it makes sense. Depression's a horrible thing. I've experienced it through various stages of my life, and it seems to be a major problem in today's world where we've created such a deficit and inequality just in standards of living and opportunity space. When you're depressed, you don't want to do anything. You just want to sleep. There's an empty gnawing void inside you. Your brain has cut you off from that ever so important reward stream that keeps you going. Things like anxiety are another form of, let's call it malformed thoughts, where something that is a survival mechanism, that allows us to think about bad situations and keep us away from them. For example, there's a tiger chasing me, I need to find shelter. But something has broken in this unconscious thought factory that it is incorrectly sending you the thoughts that there is a tiger, I must feel afraid. It's kind of a shit one. But yeah. Now, as far as we know, thoughts are transient, and what I mean by that is they're temporary. They come into existence and then they disappear. Not to be confused with a thought potentially remaining in your mind because of your memories. They are had and lost easily, quickly, and often. If you don't write a thought down, you might easily forget it, and thoughts that come quickly can disappear from your mind very quickly, as many people know after waking up from a dream, for example. I would say a good marker for intelligence is open-mindedness, because an intelligent person can accept and entertain many ideas, even if they do not accept them. Perhaps thoughts do not come as easily to the ignorant or the unintelligent, and so they cling on to the ones they have. Perhaps this is why people are so angry and ready to defend when they're wrong. Things like anti-vax hoaxes and flat earth and 5G and certain despotic leaders. These people do not want to be wrong because these thoughts that they have are the only thoughts that they have. They don't have anything else to move on to, so they cling on to it. This is the difference between someone screaming the earth is flat and being able to think, I understand why this person would think that. I think they're wrong, but I understand why they're saying the things they're saying. And someone with more entrenched thoughts may be due to their own inadequacies or their own fears, or it may be due to past trauma. I don't blame people for their thoughts or entrenched thought patterns, but it becomes a bit difficult when they become hateful towards others or try to use those entrenched thought patterns to subjugate others, be it through religion or intolerance or policy or anything along those lines. Now, that's not to say that people with strongly held opinions aren't intelligent or that the intelligent can't have strongly held opinions, but I think it's a good marker if someone with a strongly held opinion can quickly drop that opinion if they discover that they are wrong, whether they discover it through their own research or through someone else telling them. It's a commonly held notion that debates and arguments nowadays are no longer about finding the truth. It's about being right, whether you are right or not. It's about shouting at the other person until they give up, because then you get to say that you won and that you are right. Now, back on the matter of thoughts being transient, our thoughts are also heavily influenced by our environment and our peers, both positively and negatively. they are not pure signals that once formed cannot change. They aren't immutable. It's almost as if they can be cross-contaminated by other thoughts, and the way that ideas exist in our zeitgeist and meme culture, they almost act like their own entities. Thoughts can spread as easily as viruses can, but that's something that I'll discuss in a future episode. Now, again, thoughts being transient, where do they come from? Do they come from our own mind, our own experiences, and just this Jenga tower of inputs and outputs that eventually lead to a single thought? Are they streamed in? Are they due to some kind of cosmic background radiation, or a mechanism of evolution to spark novelty and innovation, to feed that ever-constant drip of dopamine and serotonin that our filthy addict bodies just absolutely crave? This episode is already getting quite long, and there's a lot more I want to explore in the way of thought. So I think this is definitely going to turn into a mini-series. So we'll discuss some of the other topics on thought in the future. So, what are the implications for today? Well, I think the only proper way to do this topic justice in the way of implications is for you to make your own. I'm going to give you a minute, or however long the implication music is, I'm not actually sure, to just think. Or don't think. Just let your mind do as it pleases. Close your eyes, maybe, unless you're driving or operating heavy machinery or looking after a child or cooking, and just think. Okay, turns out the implication music is actually quite long, so I've cut it short. I'm sorry. Welcome back to the realm of conscious thought and not unconscious thought. This is a very interesting topic to me, and even as a child, I've always wondered about the deeper intricacies of thought itself, not just on a biological standpoint, but from a conscious psychological standpoint. So this is definitely a topic that we'll explore in greater detail in the next few weeks. So I hope you enjoyed. Thank you for listening. The podcast has been going very well. I've enjoyed it. I haven't been able to record episodes as often as I'd like, just due to work and awful weather, meaning it's been too windy and too noisy to record. But yeah, I'm enjoying it. The listenership is kind of picking up, and I'm getting a bunch of viewers or listeners from around the world, places like the States and Australia and Europe. So it's been great. Thank you for listening. And I'm thinking of setting up a Patreon if you would like to support it, but don't feel obligated to, because this is just something I enjoy doing and will keep doing. My dear thinkers and dreamers, my fellow seekers of truth and knowledge, thank you for listening. You can follow the discussion on the official subreddit, r/mindpalacemusings. There's a car outside, motherfucker. You can follow the official Twitter for updates at mpm_podcast. Episodes come out every Wednesday, but due to the way the podcast RSS feeds work, I usually only put out notifications the day after, because it usually takes about a day for the podcast to show up on iTunes. If you would like to see the art I'm busy working on, you can check out my art Instagram at David_Wellman. And otherwise, all the other things that you might want, all the links and networks and things like that, are in the description. Thank you for listening. This has been Mind Palace Musings. I have been your host, David Wellman, and please stay curious.